Hey guys, I hope everyone's had a great week. On Monday, I made a video talking about the events that led to the Civil War. Today, we're going to talk about how the Civil War affected Georgia once it got started. So let's analyze the impact of the Civil War on Georgia. We're going to talk about the Union blockade of Georgia's coast, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Battle of Chickamauga, Sherman's Atlanta campaign, his march to the sea, and the Union prison camp called Andersonville that's here in Georgia. All right, so Monday we talked about three main things that led to the Civil War. The first was nullification. So the federal government passed these tariffs, so these taxes on imports, and it was made to help the northern factories. And so the South felt ignored. They felt like they weren't being considered when the federal government made this new tax. And so they nullified this law. And, you know, the government and the northern states are saying, you guys can't do that. You can't just ignore federal laws. And so that was a huge issue, this idea of states just completely ignoring or not choosing to endorse or enforce national laws. So nullification was one of them. The other thing was like basically the South said, you know, you can't tell us what to do. We're going to make decisions and choices that are best for our state. Slavery was part of that discussion. You can't tell us that we already have slaves. You northern states that don't have an agricultural economy, you're not going to tell us that we can't have slaves because we need them. You guys don't need them, but we need them because agriculture is a hard work and we need slave labor to keep our economy going. And so, of course, once the Civil War started, so slavery was a big issue already, but once President Lincoln gave his Emancipation Proclamation, the whole focus of the war turned to slavery. So slavery is the number one issue, but nullification and states' rights had their places as well. So the South thought, okay, so this whole Republican Party formed to fight against slavery, to end slavery. So as soon as Abraham Lincoln was elected and while he was running for president, the South said if he gets to become president, that means he's going to end slavery in the South. Probably he wouldn't have done that if we hadn't started the Civil War. He probably would have just kept slavery from expanding into states that didn't already have it, or as new states were added to the Union, as population kept going west. Population in the West were increasing so that these territories became states. He wanted to make sure that new states were added to the Union as free states. So he probably wouldn't have ended slavery in the South, except that the Civil War made that the main focus. He was the 16th president of the United States. When the war started, his whole idea was to preserve the Union. So as soon as those southern states seceded, he said, you guys are guilty of treason. That is a crime that's punishable by death. They started fighting. The southern states said, well, we're not even part of the United States anymore. We're our own country now. But he said, no, we're not letting you go without a fight. So like I said, the southern states were worried. A month and a half after Abraham Lincoln became president, South Carolina seceded from the Union. They were the first ones to go. Now, Georgia didn't secede right away. Actually, there was a huge debate. So our legislative party, our General Assembly is what they call it here in Georgia. There was a lot of debates, arguments, compromises made in the General Assembly. There were people that were strong supporters of both sides of the issue. Some of our legislators wanted to stay in the Union. A lot of them wanted to leave. One of the loudest and passionate men to stay in the Union was Alexander Stephens. He thought it would be devastating to us if we left the Union. Of course, he ended up being correct. It just took several years to figure that out. But Alexander Stephens was a Georgian, and as soon as all the votes were cast and he realized that we were going to secede, He was very loyal to Georgia. He stayed in the South, even though he really wanted to stay part of the Union. He stayed in the South, and in fact, he became the vice president of the Confederacy. So, you know, there's that. So he was a very important man, and he was from Georgia. So the Southern states, they did leave the Union, and they formed a new nation, and hopefully you know the name of that nation, the Confederate States of America. Now, hopefully some of you have had an opportunity to go to South Carolina. Charleston, South Carolina, right off the coast of Charleston is a little island with this fort. It's called Fort Sumter, and this is where the Civil War actually started. You can go there, you can take a ferry out to the island, and you can get off the ferry, and you can have a live guide to take you through Fort Sumter and talk to you about the Civil War. So even though this is where it was started, this wasn't a huge fight. So basically the Union soldiers were there in Fort Sumter. There was rumors of war, that people knew tensions were high. A lot of people suspected that the North and South were going to start fighting soon. And so Union soldiers were there in the Fort Sumter and South Carolina. When they seceded from the Union, they fired upon that fort. And it tells us that the Union forces were there for a long time. They were already low on ammunition and food. They were weak, and they actually surrendered the next day. So this was not a huge battle. In fact, no one was killed during the actual battle. But the South was very energized and excited because they actually won the first battle of the Civil War. There was a picture of, probably a drawing of the fort before the Civil War. So, comprehension check. Which event was the first conflict of the Civil War? The Confederate capture of Fort Sumter in South Carolina. So the South took over that fort. Now, one of the things that was going on in the South is we were very agricultural. We did not have a lot of large cities. We didn't have a lot of factories. And so a lot of the tools and the weapons and the ammunition that you needed to fight a war, the South had to get from trading with other countries. Now, the North, they had a lot of factories. They could make these things for themselves. But what did the South have a lot of? They had a lot of cotton, right? And there was a high demand in cotton across the world. And so the South was trading a lot with other countries. And one of the things that they were trading for was weapons and ammunition and other supplies that we need to fight a war. And so the Union, the North, decided if we could keep those ships from going out and trading with other countries, then we're going to cause them to have a great disadvantage. And so they came up with this war strategy called Union blockade. One of the United States, the North's most important strategies during the Civil War was called the Union blockade of Georgia's coast. The North's primary objective was to use its superior navy to prevent the South from shipping its cotton to England and France in return for weapons and other supplies. And this was considered a very successful strategy. So basically they got their Navy ships and they parked them right off the coast around the South, and they would intercept anytime they saw a Southern ship about to leave one of the ports, they would intervene and they would take it over, or they would fire upon it. But basically they kept those Southern ships from leaving the ports, and it was a very successful strategy. Now, before the Civil War, there never been photographs of actual wars that had been fought, and so the Civil War was, had this great new technology, these cameras. When writers would write about these different battles and these different wars, and now they could put pictures to that and give that to the reader. That was huge. That was this incredible new technology. So this is the first war that we actually see live pictures of. And so this is a picture right off of Georgia's coast. You can see one of the Navy's, the Union battleships sitting right off the coast, and that's what they did. They parked their ships there, and their job was to watch for the South trying to get one of their ships out. One of the other forts that's down in Savannah is called Fort Pulaski. Now this, you know, you can see where there is a moat. So obviously this picture was taken during very wet times, but there was a moat around this fort. But even if you go today, you can see the wall that shows where it was hammered by cannon fire. So this is real. This has not been created this way. This was actually created back in the Civil War. And so you can go out to Fort Pulaski and learn some information about the bombardment of Fort Pulaski during the Civil War. Some more pictures. The walls, part of the walls were destroyed by cannons. All right, so what was the Union war strategy called that tried to prevent ships from leaving or coming into southern ports? It was called Union Blockade. Another nickname was Anaconda Plan. You know how snakes, anacondas will surround their victim, and every time the victim takes a breath, it squeezes harder and harder, and eventually it suffocates it. And so that was another nickname for the Union blockade, that it was saying basically they're going to suffocate their enemy. It's going to take a long time, but slow and steady wins the race, I guess is what you could say. All right, so like I said, at the beginning of the war, the focus was on preserving the Union, but as soon as President Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, it changed the whole focus. Now he had this document, he had written it, and he wasn't ready to release it until he knew it would be highly supported by the United States of America, which is the North at this point. So he waited until after the North had a victory, what they considered a victory, so that the morale in the North would be, you know, would be up, and they would be ready to embrace the idea of freeing all the slaves in the United States. So the bloodiest one-day battle of the Civil War was called the Battle of Antietam. Thousands and thousands of men lost their lives in this battle. It was actually considered a draw, which means a tie, but the Union is the ones that called themselves the winner. And it was at that time that Abraham Lincoln decided that he would issue his Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation actually said, hey, Southern states, if you guys will surrender, you can keep your slaves. But if you don't surrender, I'm going to give freedom to your slaves, which of course they weren't part of the United States. So he really didn't have the authority to do that, but he said it anyway. That's like someone in America saying, hey, we are declaring that North Korea, you are no longer communist. Well, it sounds good, but we don't have the authority to do that. Well, that's kind of like the Emancipation Proclamation. The South wasn't part of the United States, but Abraham Lincoln said, I'm going to free your slaves. And then, of course, after the war, this was the document that was used to free the slaves. And we passed the 13th Amendment after the war that gave slaves their freedom. But anyway, this Emancipation Proclamation was used to free all the slaves that was fighting against the Union. Lincoln's proclamation shifted the focus of the Civil War from preserving the Union to freeing the slaves at this point. So this was in 1862. And it was big news, big news. All right. So the other thing the Emancipation Proclamation did is it told fugitive slaves, hey slaves, if you leave the South, you come to the North and we want you to fight for us. You have the right to fight against the evils of slavery and we want you to join us. And that's exactly what many of them did. So who issued the proclamation? It was Abraham Lincoln. What was the purpose of it? It declared all states in rebel Confederate states to be, it declared all slaves in rebel Confederate states to be free and allowed slaves to enlist in the Union Army. And why was it significant? It changed the focus of the war to freeing slaves. It gave many Northerners a reason to fight, and as many as 100,000 former slaves fought with the Union. That's a lot of people, you guys, a lot of people. All right, so Georgia was free from major battles during the first 2 years of the Civil War, The Union soon realized that destroying Atlanta would mean defeat for the Confederacy. So after all these wars were going on a lot in northern states and the middle states, the North finally realized, hey, you know what? Atlanta is this major railroad hub. If we can destroy Atlanta, we're going to have a huge shot at winning this war. So that's where their focus turned. In 1863, Georgia became a target for the Union. So the Battle of Chickamauga. After capturing Chattanooga, a railroad center in Tennessee, 58,000 Union troops marched south from Tennessee into Georgia on September 18, 1863. The major impact of war arrived on Georgia's doorstep in 1863 in the Battle of Chickamauga. 66,000 Confederates fought against the Union soldiers along Chickamauga Creek for 3 days. 3 days, you guys. Can you even imagine? War is horrendous, and this battle lasted for 3 days. Thousands and thousands and thousands of men died on the Chickamauga battlefield. After 16,000 men were killed from both sides, the Union Army retreated back up into Tennessee. The Battle of Chickamauga was a very important Confederate victory, so the South won that battle, and it became the largest Union defeat. The Battle of Chickamauga was the largest battle ever fought in the state of Georgia. It was a victory for the South, but they had so much loss of life that instead of immediately following the Union back up into Tennessee and just pursuing them, they won, they're going to keep pursuing them. They took a few days, they assessed their losses, and they kind of allowed the North to go back up, the Union to go back up into Chattanooga, and they refocused. They gained a lot of soldiers that had joined them, and so they actually, once the South finally got back up into Chattanooga to confront them again, the Union beat them. So they lost this opportunity to keep that momentum going. They didn't follow through. So even though Chickamauga was a win for the South, because of the way they handled it, they ended up losing eventually after that. All right, so you can go, just like you can go to Fort Sumter, you can also go to Chickamauga Battlefield. You can, it's now a state park. It's a beautiful park, actually. You can go walking there. There's bike trails. They have reenactments of the Civil War there. Beautiful place to visit. A lot of monuments and things that you can read about the Civil War. So like I said, once the Union got down to Chattanooga, and once they won that little skirmish in Chattanooga, they decided we've got to get to Atlanta. So William T. Sherman decided, I am going to get to Atlanta and we're going to do some damage, and that became known as his Atlanta campaign. In 1864, General William T. Sherman moved his Union Army south from Tennessee to Atlanta. They fought Confederate soldiers along the way, leaving a path of destruction and chaos. General Sherman wanted to capture Atlanta because Atlanta was the major railroad hub of the South and had adequate industrial capabilities. So a live picture of William T. Sherman. This is a picture of Sherman in Atlanta. So look behind him, look at all those fields and hills. That doesn't look like Atlanta, does it? Things have changed quite a bit. But Sherman was there in Atlanta. On September 2nd, 1862, Sherman's troops captured Atlanta and set the city on fire. Sherman's Atlanta campaign marked the beginning of the end of the war. So Atlanta was this major city, very important railroad hub of the South, and Sherman knew, you know what, if we can decimate Atlanta, we're going to cripple the South, and that's exactly what happened. What was the Atlanta campaign? It was the Union's effort to capture Atlanta, led by General Sherman. And why did the Union want to capture Atlanta? Sherman wanted to disrupt the transportation and industry in the South. So there's a picture of Peachtree Street, downtown Atlanta. See this building right here, completely destroyed. There's other destruction. It's kind of hard to see that picture, but look at that. That was a train roundhouse in Atlanta. This is where the train would come in, and this turntable would actually turn, and it could put a train on a different rail track. Totally destroyed that. So once they decimated Atlanta, if you guys have ever seen Gone with the Wind, there's a great part in that movie where they're showing that they're going through Atlanta and it's just burning all around them. It's just and that movie was made back in the 1930s. So the pictures and the way that movie was made is just amazing. But anyway, the next day, Sherman split his army in two and continued what they called the March to the Sea from Atlanta to Savannah. Sherman instructed his soldiers to destroy any towns and plantations along the way in order to crush the remaining fighting spirit of the South. And that's exactly what happened. So a picture depicting that they're tearing apart the railroads, destroying everything in their path. Here's some buildings after Sherman went through Atlanta and other cities. On his way to Savannah, here they are tearing apart the railroads. They did a lot of damage indeed. And it wasn't like a single path. They split up. You can see all the paths they took. 300 miles they marched from Atlanta to Savannah, destroying everything on their way. Sherman's march cut Confederate supply lines and crushed the spirit of the Confederate Army. Union troops captured Savannah on December 21st, 1864, and Sherman wrote Lincoln a note, and he said, "I am presenting the city of Savannah to you as a Christmas gift." Now, when I went to Savannah and I did a couple of tours, a lot of them, claim that once Sherman got to Savannah and he saw how beautiful the city is, he just couldn't find it in his heart to destroy it. But who knows? Who knows which is true, but he did not destroy Savannah, but he destroyed every city on the way down there. The Confederacy surrendered on April 9th, 1865. And one of the things that's so sad, not only was Abraham Lincoln shot, but look at that. The North won April 9th, and Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th. He didn't even get to enjoy a victory. So he was, the whole time he was president, we were fighting the war. All right, what type of destruction did General Sherman's army cause on their march to the sea? It left Georgia in ruins by the Union, scorching towns, homes, buildings, and Union soldiers took many valuables from citizens. What did General Sherman present to Abraham Lincoln as a Christmas gift? The city of Savannah. Sherman estimated the property damage at $100 million for the South. So very devastating. So a lot of people have just villainized Sherman. They said it was overkill. He didn't have to do so much destruction, but his whole focus was to kill the spirit of the South. And he knew if he did that, they would surrender, and that's exactly what happened. All right, so after the war, during the war, there were prison camps. The North had prison camps and the South had prison camps. In every ward, there's prison camps. But when a soldier is captured and they're sent to a prison camp, there are rules to war. You're not supposed to torture them, or you're supposed to, still take care of them. Of course, that's not been followed by many, many nations over the years. But in South Georgia, we had this prison camp for Union soldiers it later became known as Andersonville. Fort Sumter was, I think, the official name, but there was a railroad station close by. It was called Andersonville, so the nickname of this prison camp became Andersonville. It was one of the most notorious sites of the Civil War, this prison camp in Andersonville, Georgia. More than 45,000 captured Union soldiers were sent to this overcrowded camp. So the camp was actually made to hold 10,000, but they had over 30,000 soldiers there at one time, and the conditions were horrendous. So basically, they had planned on creating a roof for this prison camp, but the soldiers started coming a lot sooner than they were supposed to, and so they didn't have time to finish. And so this basically was an open field. So the guys, the prisoners, just were out in the elements of South Georgia. So imagine how hot it is in Georgia in June, July, August, outside all day, no shade, no way to get out from under the sun. And even South Georgia, I know it doesn't get very cold, but it gets cold. So imagine being outside in the elements in November, December, January, February. These men lived outside in this very, very overcrowded prison. They didn't have enough water. They didn't have enough food. And some people have estimated that up to 18,000 of them died there at the prison. Inside the prison, there was barely any food to eat, and the only water source was a filthy stream that flowed through the middle of the camp. So this stream is where they got their drinking water. This stream is where they bathed. This stream is where they would use the bathroom. So you can imagine the terrible conditions 30,000 people could make out of a tiny little stream, how much disease this little water stream had in it, and how many people got sick from drinking this water, but they didn't really have a choice. That was the only water they had access to. Prisoners lived outside with few clothes and had to construct their own shelters made from sticks, cloth scraps, and mud. Living conditions were terrible, and many suffered from starvation, disease, and insect attacks. And there were walls. This part of the wall hadn't been finished yet, but there were walls around the whole camp, and there was a 3-foot zone around the whole prison. And if you stepped over that line within 3 feet of the walls, you would get shot right on the spot, no warning. And they even had recruited kids, teenagers from the nearby town, and they put them up in these towers, and they were the ones that were told to shoot any prisoner that stepped over that line. And some of the prisoners, it got so bad that some of the prisoners stepped over the line on purpose to kind of force those kids to shoot and kill them. So this was every day for 3 years. The conditions were horrendous, very sad. You can go there. I've gone there too. They have rebuilt part of the wall, and then these are those little towers I was telling you about. The people would stand there, and if you came into this little area where past that little wooden fence, that was called the kill zone. They would shoot you right on the spot. After the war, after they realized the conditions of this prison camp, states went down there because every state was affected in the north. They had people that died there, and there's monuments all over this area where people went down. They try to recover the dead. They try to identify the dead, and they put up these memorial monuments for people that suffered in that camp and died. There's my hubby and my dog, Max. But that is the water source that they had. So imagine 30,000 men, day in and day out. This is the only water source they had. It went straight through the middle of what would have been their prison camp. Just terrible to think about. It was just a very humbling experience to be there and just to think about what those men went through. And they had their own cemetery because they had so many people, up to 100 people die a day at the worst part of the war. And you drive through here and there's just thousands and thousands of these tombstones, and look how close they are. I mean, they just laid these men shoulder to shoulder to shoulder to shoulder. And it was a miracle. They had a group of women went down there, and they were able to identify every single prisoner that died. And sometimes they just made a big open grave and just dumped all the bodies in there because they were dying so fast. They were dying faster than they can properly bury them, but after the war, people went down there to make sure that these men were able to be buried properly, and each of them were identified. Now, there's this great movie called Andersonville. If you were here in the building, we would watch it together. But anyway, maybe you can get a copy and watch Andersonville. But they had these gangs inside the prison camp. So not only were the conditions horrendous, but they had gangs that would go around and steal from other prisoners. Well, eventually the other prisoners were so mad that they got permission from the commander of the warden of the prison camp, and they allowed the prisoners to put these 6 men on trial because of the crimes they were committing on the other criminals. They actually tried them. They had someone act as the judge. They had a jury. They had lawyers representing the guys. These were all prisoners inside this prison camp. The jury found these men guilty, and the guards let them bring in enough wood and rope, and they actually hung these men. So these, of all those graves, these 6 are separated, and it's because they were found guilty by the other prisoners, and the prisoners themselves had these men hung. So very interesting. And this is all true stories, but like I said, there's just thousands and thousands of these grave sites. And also they will still bury veterans here in the cemetery. So this has also become a cemetery for veterans, any war veterans. All right, so why did 13,000 to 18,000? I'm not sure exactly what the number is, but it was a lot. 13,000 to 18,000 Union soldiers die in this prison. It was because they died of starvation, mainly waterborne and airborne disease, and very unsanitary living conditions. All right, you guys, I'm sorry I try to make it as short as I could. I know I have a lot to say, but it's because there's so much in these standards. So anyway, hopefully you guys got a little bit out of that, and you will have your test next week. So I will check in with you guys later.